The year was 1872, and the air of Montmartre, Paris, was thick with the scent of absinthe and revolution. Elise, a struggling painter, spent her days crafting desperate sketches in a dim atelier. Her evenings, however, were devoted to wandering the vibrant streets, seeking inspiration in the flickering gaslights and whispered secrets of the city. One fateful evening, Elise attended a masquerade at the invitation of a patron. The lavish ballroom, adorned with crimson drapes and flickering chandeliers, pulsed with sensual energy. She was drawn to a man standing at the edge of the crowd. Tall and dressed in black, with raven hair and piercing emerald eyes, Lucien exuded an aura that was equal parts danger and allure. Their eyes met across the room, and Elise felt an electric pull. She approached, unable to resist the magnetic force between them. "You're an artist," Lucien said, his voice smooth as silk. "I can see it in your eyes." "And you're a man of secrets," she replied, emboldened by the wine she had sipped. Lucien smirked. "Careful, ma chérie. Curiosity has been known to kill more than cats." Their conversation spiraled into a dance of flirtation and mystery, and before the night ended, Lucien offered to escort her home. As they walked, he spoke of art, passion, and a world beyond her imagination. Lucien became Elise's muse and obsession. He visited her studio daily, his presence igniting a fervor in her that translated into paintings of breathtaking beauty. His touch was intoxicating, his whispers promises of pleasure she had never dared to dream of. Their first night together was an explosion of passion. Lucien's kisses ignited fires along her skin, his touch sending her to the brink of ecstasy. But in the haze of pleasure, Elise glimpsed something unsettling, a shadow in his eyes, a hunger that seemed otherworldly. Still, she dismissed her unease, consumed by the thrill of their. One night, Elise awoke to find Lucien gone. Following the faint sound of whispers, she crept to the balcony. There, she saw him standing under the moonlight, speaking in a language that sent chills down her spine. His silhouette seemed to shift, his shadow elongating unnaturally. The next morning, she confronted him. "What are you, Lucien?" He hesitated, his face a mask of torment. "I am cursed, Elise. Bound by an ancient pact to feed on the souls of those I love. You are my greatest temptation, and my greatest regret." Elise recoiled in horror. But even as she fled, her heart ached for him. Unable to resist his pull, Elise returned to Lucien, demanding to know more. He revealed the truth. Centuries ago, he had been a mortal man, seduced by a demon who promised him eternal life in exchange for his servitude. Ever since, he had been bound to seduce and destroy, his love a death sentence for those who succumbed. "I would rather die than live without you," Elise declared. Their nights became a dance of pleasure and pain. Elise reveled in Lucien's touch, even as she felt the toll of his curse. Her health waned, her paintings grew darker, her dreams haunted by visions of shadows and fire. One stormy night, Lucien offered her an escape. "I can break the curse, but it requires a sacrifice, your humanity. Join me in eternal darkness, and we can be together forever." Elise hesitated. The life she knew would be lost. But the thought of a world without Lucien was unbearable. As lightning illuminated the room, she made her decision. Elise drank from Lucien's wrist, the metallic taste of blood mingling with the intoxicating pleasure that surged through her. Pain and ecstasy merged as her mortal life ebbed away. When she awoke, her senses were heightened. She could hear the rain whisper against the glass, feel the pulse of the city's life in the distance. Lucien smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride and hunger. Weeks after Elise's transformation were a sensations. Every touch, every whisper from Lucien carried an electrifying intensity. Their nights were filled with passion that pushed the boundaries of human experience, her heightened senses making every caress feel like fire under her skin. Lucien guided her into her new existence with a mix of tenderness and primal urgency, teaching her the balance between their shared lust for blood and the love that bound them. Yet, as much as Elise reveled in their connection, she couldn't ignore the changes within her. Hunger gnawed at her insides, a need not just for blood but for dominance, for control. The more she fed, the darker her thoughts became. Lucien noticed. "You're fighting it," he murmured one night as they lay tangled together in their lavish hideaway. "You must embrace it, Elise. The hunger, the power, it's who we are now." But Elise wasn't so sure. As she painted feverishly in the candlelight, her work took on a sinister edge, her canvases depicting scenes of torment and forbidden pleasures. One evening, during one of their stolen strolls through the Parisian underworld, Elise felt a presence, a man watching her from the shadows. His intense gaze was unrelenting, his demeanor sharp and dangerous. Who was that? She whispered as Lucien pulled her closer. "Trouble," he growled, his jaw tightening. "He's one of the hunters. They've been following me for centuries." Elise's pulse quickened, but it wasn't just fear that coursed through her. The stranger's dark allure had ignited something unfamiliar in her, a dangerous curiosity. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, Elise sought the man out. She found him in a hidden courtyard, his blade gleaming under the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," he warned, his voice low and gravelly. "Do you even know what he is?" "I know more than you think," she replied, her voice defiant. The hunter introduced himself as Raphael, a man sworn to destroy creatures like they spoke. An undeniable tension grew between them. Raphael wasn't like Lucien, his touch was rough, his words harsh, but beneath the surface was a vulnerability that intrigued Elise. When he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, her breath caught. The connection between them was raw and forbidden, a stark contrast to the all-consuming passion she shared with Lucien. Elise's world became a dangerous game of deception. She continued to share nights of unbridled passion with Lucien, his dominance and love consuming her. But she couldn't resist the pull of Raphael, meeting him in secret to unravel his secrets and her own conflicting desires. The duality of her existence was exhilarating and terrifying. With Lucien, she was a creature of the night, feeding on the lifeblood of unsuspecting victims and surrendering to the ecstasy of their bond. With Raphael, she felt the remnants of her humanity, a dangerous reminder of the woman she used to be. Lucien began to notice Elise's restlessness. His jealousy simmered beneath the surface, his possessive nature growing more intense. "You've changed," he accused one night, pinning her against the wall. "You've been meeting someone." Elise's heart raced, but she refused to admit the truth. "You're imagining things," she whispered, her voice trembling, but Lucien's emerald eyes burned with fury. "Do not lie to me, Elise. I gave you eternity. Betray me, and I will take it back." As the tension between the three reached a breaking point, Elise found herself caught in a web of lust, love, and betrayal. Lucien's love was dark and consuming, his touch a promise of eternal pleasure. Raphael's presence was a spark of forbidden temptation, a reminder of the human emotions she thought she had left behind. When Raphael revealed his plan to destroy Lucien, Elise was forced to choose. Could she betray the man who had given her, or would she risk everything for a chance at redemption, and the forbidden allure of Raphael's touch? The showdown came on a stormy night in an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Paris. Elise stood between Lucien and Raphael, her heart torn as they faced each other like predators ready to strike. "Elise, come to me," Lucien commanded, his voice a hypnotic mix of seduction and fury. "No, Elise," Raphael countered, his eyes filled with a desperation that mirrored her own. "You're not like him. You can still be free." In that moment, Elise made her choice, a decision that would forever seal her fate in the realms of darkness or light. As dawn broke over Paris, only two figures emerged from the chapel. Elise's choice had shattered one bond and forged another, but the consequences of her decision would haunt her for eternity. Bound by desire, love, and the shadows of their past, Elise and her chosen lover disappeared into the night, their story destined to be whispered among the living and the damned alike. Lucien, but her heart was heavier than she had expected. The confrontation with Raphael lingered in her mind, his words haunting her dreams like faint whispers. Yet, in Lucien's embrace, those thoughts melted into the background, replaced by an overwhelming passion that devoured her completely. Their nights were a blend of fire and shadow, his lips tracing every curve of her body, her cries echoing in the opulent chambers they now shared. Lucien's dominance was intoxicating, and Elise found herself craving his control, each encounter pushing her to new heights of pleasure and surrender. but beneath the ecstasy, Lucien's behavior began to shift. His jealousy hardened into possessiveness. His gaze darker, almost predatory. He watched her as though she were prey, and Elise couldn't shake the feeling that her independence was slipping away. One evening, Lucien brought Elise to a masquerade hosted by a cabal of immortals. The grand ballroom dripped with decadence, gilded mirrors, silk draperies, and the lingering scent of blood. The other vampires regarded Elise with thinly veiled disdain, their eyes flicking to her as though she were an object. Lucien's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her closer. "Do not wander, ma chérie. They will devour you whole." Despite his warning, Elise's curiosity got the better of her. She slipped away into the shadows, only to find herself cornered by a female vampire with pale, translucent skin and eyes like liquid silver. "You're his little pet," the woman hissed, circling Elise. "Do you know how many have come before you? How many he's discarded when he grew bored?" The word struck Elise like a dagger, and though she tried to dismiss them, doubt began to take root in her heart. Elise confronted Lucien later that night, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Am I just another toy to you? Another conquest?" Lucien's expression darkened, his charm giving way to something far more "Do not mistake my love for weakness, Elise. I chose you because you are different. Do not give me a reason to regret it." Their argument escalated, the tension between them spilling over into a violent, passionate embrace. His kisses were rough, his hands gripping her with a force that bordered on painful. Yet Elise found herself surrendering to him, her body betraying the turmoil in her mind. In the days that followed, Elise became restless. She returned to painting, seeking solace in her art. But her work grew darker, reflecting the chaos within her. One evening, while wandering the city in search of inspiration, she encountered Raphael again. He was wounded, leaning against a crumbling wall. His blade slick with black blood. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, but his voice lacked the venom of their first meeting. Elise ignored his warning and tended to his wounds. In his vulnerability, she saw a side of him that stirred something deep within her, a longing for the humanity she had lost. "Why do you fight them?" she asked softly. "Because someone has to," Raphael replied, his gaze meeting hers. "They destroy everything they touch." Their connection deepened that night, and Elise found herself torn between the fiery passion she shared with Lucien and the fragile, tender bond forming with Raphael. Lucien grew more volatile, his jealousy consuming him. He began to suspect Elise's secrets, his possessive nature pushing him to the edge. One night, he confronted her in the gallery where she worked. "You've been with him," he snarled, his eyes glowing with fury. Elise's silence was answer enough. Lucien's rage erupted, and for the first time, Elise feared him. He grabbed her wrists, his grip like iron, and pressed her against the cold stone wall. "You are mine, Elise," he growled, his voice dripping with both anger and desire. "Do not forget that." Yet even as fear coursed through her, Elise couldn't deny the pull he had over her. His lips clenched. A battle of dominance and submission. Lucien's obsession reached its peak when he discovered Raphael's location. He gave Elise an ultimatum: betray Raphael and prove her loyalty, or face the consequences. Elise was torn. She knew Raphael was her only chance at breaking free from Lucien's control, but betraying him would mean severing the fragile bond they shared. The decision weighed heavily on her as she met Raphael in their secret place. His wounds had healed, but his eyes were weary. "He knows," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Then it's over," Raphael said, his voice resigned. "But I won't run. If this is how it ends, so be it." The confrontation took place in the ruins of an ancient cathedral, the moonlight casting eerie shadows over the scene. Lucien arrived, his power radiating like a storm, while Raphael stood his ground, defiant but clearly outmatched. Elise watched, her heart breaking as the two men she cared for clashed. The battle was brutal, their movements a blur of fury and violence. In the end, it was Elise who made the final move. Grabbing Raphael's blade, she drove it through Lucien's heart, tears streaming down her face as he crumpled to the ground. I loved you, Lucien whispered, his voice fading as the life drained from his body. And I will always remember you, Elise replied, her voice trembling. With Lucien gone, Elise and Raphael fled the city. Though she mourned the loss of the passion she shared with Lucien, she found solace in Raphael's steady presence. Their love was not the fiery inferno she had known, but a steady flame that gave her hope for the future. Yet, as they traveled into the unknown, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that Lucien's shadow still lingered. Somewhere, in the depths of her soul, she knew that their story was far from over. Life with Raphael began quietly. They traveled to the countryside, seeking refuge in an old manor hidden deep within the woods. The isolation was meant to shield them from Lucien's allies, who would surely seek revenge. But peace eluded Elise. Her nights were plagued by vivid nightmares of Lucien, his touch, his voice, the fire in his eyes as he whispered her name. She awoke in a cold sweat, her body trembling with both fear and longing. Raphael noticed her unrest, but Elise kept the truth buried, unwilling to admit that she still felt bound to Lucien. The cracks in their sanctuary deepened when strange occurrences began to plague the manor. Doors creaked open in the dead of night. Shadows flickered in the corners of Elise's vision. The air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the house itself were alive. One evening, Raphael returned from gathering supplies to find Elise sitting in the darkened parlor, her eyes glazed over. She clutched one of her old paintings, a haunting portrait of Lucien, his emerald eyes gleaming with a predatory allure. Where did you find that? Raphael asked, his voice sharp. I didn't, Elise whispered, her voice distant. It found me. Raphael took the painting from her, intending to burn it, but as he touched the canvas, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He flinched, dropping it to the floor. Blood seeped from his palm. As if the painting itself had bitten him. We're not alone here, he murmured, his voice laced with dread. The next day, Raphael left to seek help from a nearby village. Alone in the manor, Elise wandered the halls, her thoughts clouded with memories of Lucien. She found herself drawn to the cellar, where the air was thick with the smell of decay. There, in the flickering light of a single candle, she saw him. Lucien's figure stood at the edge of the shadows, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You thought you could kill me? He said, his voice smooth as backed away, her heart pounding. You're dead, she stammered. I saw you die. Lucien stepped closer, his smile wicked. You cannot kill what you are bound to, Elise. Did you really think I would let you go so easily? The apparition vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but Elise felt a cold hand grip her heart. She wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. That night, Raphael returned to find the village priest dead on the front steps of the manor, his throat slit and his eyes wide with terror. A message was scrawled in blood across the door, she belongs to me. The days that followed were a nightmare. Raphael set traps around the manor, convinced they were being hunted by one of Lucien's followers. But the true threat was far closer than he realized. Elise began to change. Her nights were filled with vivid, erotic dreams of Lucien, his hands and lips igniting a fire within her that Raphael could no longer quench. She woke to find scratches on her skin, as if Lucien's touch had transcended the dream world. Raphael grew distant, his frustration mounting as Elise became more erratic. She found herself drawn to the cellar, where whispers called to her from the darkness. One night, Raphael followed her. He found her standing before an old mirror, her reflection distorted and monstrous. Elise, step away from that, he demanded, but she turned to him with a wicked smile, her eyes glowing with a familiar green light. He's here, Raphael. He never left. Lucien's influence consumed Elise, driving her into a frenzy. She began to see everyone as a threat to her connection with him. The hunger for blood returned, stronger and more insatiable than ever. The first victim was a traveling merchant who had stopped at the manor for shelter. Elise seduced him, her beauty and vulnerability luring him into her trap. As he leaned in for a kiss, she sank her teeth into his throat, reveling in the warm rush of his lifeblood. Raphael discovered dead body the next morning. Horror growing as he realized Elise was no longer the woman he loved. She's under his control, he whispered to himself. But I won't lose her. Raphael prepared for a confrontation, arming himself with silver blades and holy water. He found Elise in the cellar, standing before the mirror with a bloodied smile. You can't save me, Raphael, she said, her voice dripping with malice. He's part of me now. He always was. Lucien's voice echoed through the room. You should have stayed away, Hunter. Now, you'll die for taking what's mine. The mirror shattered, and Lucien emerged from the shards, his form ghostly yet solid. The battle that followed was brutal and bloody, the small cellar becoming a battleground of love and vengeance. Raphael fought with everything he had, but Lucien was too strong. Just as all seemed lost, Elise made a choice. She drove Raphael's blade into her own heart, severing the bond between her and Lucien. Lucien's scream echoed through the manor as his form disintegrated, the power that bound him to Elise dissolving into nothingness. Raphael cradled Elise's body in his arms, tears streaming down his face. She smiled weakly, her human eyes returning for the first time in weeks. You saved me, she whispered, but Raphael felt no triumph. The woman he loved was gone, leaving him alone in the cursed manor. As he buried her beneath the old oak tree, he vowed to destroy every trace of Lucien's dark legacy. No matter the cost, but as he turned to leave, he felt a familiar chill in the air and heard a whisper, she will rise. Raphael stood before the grave, his hands trembling as he wiped away the cold sweat clinging to his skin. The earth beneath his feet seemed to pulsate, as if alive with some ancient malevolent force. Elise was gone, buried under a thick layer of dirt and death, but Raphael could feel her presence, an unshakable weight pressing against his chest. The whisper had been faint, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. She will rise again, and in the shadows, something stirred. Days passed, and the silence of the manor was deafening. Raphael locked himself inside, obsessed with eradicating the remnants of Lucien's influence, convinced the curse could not be vanquished by mere death. He searched every inch of the manor, each room darker and more oppressive than the last, but the oppressive feeling never left him. The whispering continued, seeping into his mind, pulling him back to the cellar. That night, as the wind howled outside, Raphael heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden floor. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. It was the sound of nails dragging across the boards, the unmistakable sign of something, or someone, crawling. His heart raced, each beat louder than the last. He grabbed his weapons, an assortment of silver knives, holy water, and crucifixes, and made his way to the cellar door. As he opened it, the darkness inside swallowed him whole. Colder than any place he had been before. The flickering candlelight barely illuminated the stone walls as his eyes scanned the room. The cellar was empty, but something was wrong. The air smelled of blood, fresh blood, and the ground was slick with it. Raphael's heart sank as his gaze fell upon the figure in the corner. It was Elise, but she was not the woman he had buried. The body he had left in the grave was no longer the one that stood before him, dripping in dark crimson. Her once beautiful face was twisted, her skin pale and stretched taut over sharp, bone-like eyes were wide, hollow voids of blackness, and her lips curled into a grotesque grin, stained with the blood of an unknown victim. Raphael's blood ran cold. Elise. He whispered, his voice barely audible, his mind reeling from the horror. What have you become? She tilted her head, her broken neck cracking as she did so. What I was always meant to be, she hissed, her voice a rasp of hunger. You cannot save me. No one can. Before he could react, Elise lunged at him, faster than he could fathom. Her hands gripped his throat, digging sharp, unnatural nails into his skin, squeezing the air from his lungs. He fought back with everything he had, his knife slicing through the air. But it was like fighting a shadow. She was everywhere, her laughter echoing in his mind as her strength grew, the desire to consume him taking over. You should have never buried me, she snarled, her teeth tearing at his flesh. You should have never thought I would stay dead. With a final, desperate cry, Raphael drove a silver knife deep into her chest, the force of the strike pushing her back. She shrieked in agony, a sound that made his blood run even colder. Her body convulsed, her mouth opening in a silent scream as black veins spread across her skin. She fell to the ground, but instead of dying, she began to twist, her body distorting like a broken marionette. The darkness inside her seemed to swell. And for a moment, Raphael thought he was seeing things. Lucien, a figure stepped from the shadows, his features taking form. The man who had once held Elise captive, the man whose touch had corrupted her very soul. Lucien smiled, his sharp fangs glistening in the dim light. Did you really think you could destroy me that easily? Raphael's world crumbled. Lucien wasn't just a vampire, he was something far worse. And now, he had returned, claiming Elise once more. You have no idea what you've unleashed, Lucien purred, stepping closer to Raphael. She was always meant to be mine. And you will pay for taking her from me. The fight that followed was brutal, far beyond anything Raphael had experienced. Lucien was a force of nature, his speed and strength overwhelming. Raphael barely managed to avoid the first strike, a slash so swift that it would have torn him in half had he not dodged at the last second, but it wasn't just Lucien he had to worry about. Elise's twisted form was still moving, crawling across the floor like a hungry animal, her eyes locked onto him with a predatory gleam. She was no longer the woman he loved, but a monster, a bloodthirsty beast driven by hunger and rage. In a flash of violence, Raphael was on the ground. Elise's weight crushing him. Her mouth opened wide, her teeth sinking into his flesh, drinking deeply from his neck. Pain, sharp and unrelenting, surged through him. He could feel his life draining away as her ravenous hunger took control, but something inside him snapped. In one last act of defiance, Raphael summoned all his strength. He kicked Elise off of him and reached for his holy water. He splashed it across her face, and she recoiled, shrieking in agony. The skin on her face began to burn and blister, revealing the rotting monster beneath. Lucien's face twisted in fury. You dare! Before he could finish, Raphael plunged a silver knife into his chest, the blade piercing through his heart. Lucien let out a guttural scream as his body contorted, his form cracking and breaking apart, turning into dust before Raphael's eyes. But just as the vampire king disintegrated, his final curse was whispered into the air. You will all pay, you will all burn. Raphael stumbled to his feet, blood pouring from his wounds. Elise stood before him, her monstrous form still twisted, her eyes dark with madness. She wasn't human anymore, she was a weapon, a tool of destruction. Raphael's heart ached as he looked into the eyes of the woman he once loved. Elise, fight this, but her response was nothing more than a growl. Her teeth bared, her body rippling with unnatural strength as she charged at him, her arms outstretched. The final battle was a frenzy of violence, blades clashing, flesh tearing, screams of agony and rage filling the air, and in the end, it was Raphael who struck the fatal blow, driving a silver knife deep into Elise's heart, the force of his strike enough to sever the bond between her and the curse that held her. She fell to the ground, her body crumbling into dust, and for the first time in weeks, the manor grew silent, but Raphael knew better than to think it was over. Lucien's curse was still alive, festering in the darkness. And soon, it would come for him too. As Raphael stood over the ashes of Elise, his heart broken and torn, he whispered into the emptiness of the room, his voice laced with grief and rage. Raphael stumbled back from the remnants of Elise, his body covered in the blood of the woman he had once adored. The room reeked of iron and decay as her remains turned to ash, but the violence, the horror, lingered in the air like a heavy fog. His breath came in jagged, gasping inhales as he wiped the blood from his eyes, feeling the weight of what he had just done. But something was wrong. A tremor ran through him as the room seemed to shift. The walls were pulsing, dripping with a thick, dark substance, and an unnatural chill filled the air. The light from his dying candles flickered wildly, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like demonic fingers. Then he heard it. A whisper, Raphael, you can't escape it. You can't escape me. He froze. His heart pounded against his ribcage as the voice echoed in his mind, seeping into every corner of his consciousness. The ground beneath him seemed to writhe, as if alive with something ancient, something vengeful. The darkness in the room grew oppressive, the shadows taking on a shape. He turned slowly, his muscles tense, his hand gripping the hilt of his silver blade as he braced himself for whatever nightmare had emerged from the pit of hell. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something, or someone, approaching. His eyes darted around, but there was no escape. The door was locked, the windows sealed. He was trapped in the suffocating nightmare he had unknowingly entered. Then, from the shadows, Lucien appeared, but Lucien was not the man he remembered. His body was a grotesque patchwork of decaying flesh and raw, exposed sinew. His eyes, once a piercing shade of green, were now black pits that seemed to draw in the very light around him. A cruel smile curled at the edges of his lips as he stepped forward, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You thought you could destroy me? You thought you could free her from me?" Lucien's voice was filled with a sick, twisted amusement. "You were always mine. And now, so are you." Before Raphael could react, Lucien's hand shot out with inhuman speed, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The pressure was crushing, and Raphael struggled to breathe as his feet kicked uselessly in the air. Lucien's laughter was a harsh, maniacal sound. "I've been feeding off the fear, the pain. For so long. You think I can be defeated so easily? I am the darkness that binds this place. I am what she became." Raphael's vision blurred as the blood rushed to his head. He grasped for the blade at his side, but Lucien's grip was like iron, tightening with every passing second. The walls around him seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped to freezing levels. "I can see it in your eyes," Lucien continued, his voice dripping with venom. "The regret, the guilt. You thought you could save her. But there's nothing left to save. She was already mine when she took my blood." With one last burst of strength, Raphael slammed his silver blade into Lucien's side, the sharp edge slicing through the vampiric flesh. Lucien screamed in agony, dropping Raphael to the floor as his form twisted and contorted, writhing in pain, but the creature wasn't finished. As Raphael scrambled to his feet, Lucien's body split open, revealing a mass of writhing tendrils of darkness that reached for him with unnatural speed. Raphael's chest heaved as he tried to back away. But Lucien's twisted limbs grabbed him, pulling him into the center of the room. He felt the cold, clammy hands wrap around his throat once again, squeezing the life from him as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Lucien's laughter filled the room, a horrible cacophony of madness and malice. "You still don't understand, do you?" he hissed. "This place, this curse, it doesn't end. Not for you. Not for anyone." Raphael gasped for air, his vision fading as the darkness swallowed him whole. But then, something inside, with a force of will he didn't know he had, he reached down deep into his soul and, using the last of his strength, plunged the silver knife into Lucien's heart once more. The result was explosive. Lucien's body erupted in a burst of blood and black smoke, a horrific scream tearing through the air as his form disintegrated into nothingness. But as Lucien's physical body fell apart, his presence remained, swirling in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating and relentless. Raphael, soaked in blood, collapsed to the floor, his body battered and broken. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process the nightmare that had unfolded. He had thought he was free. He had hoped that by killing Lucien, he could end the madness, the torment. But he had only set something far darker in motion, the blood. It was everywhere. It stained the walls, the floors, his own hands, but the worst part was the scent, a sickly, sweet odor that made his stomach turn. The blood wasn't just from Lucien. No, it was from the others, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of victims who had fallen prey to this hellish place. Raphael couldn't help but look around, his gaze catching on the bloodied remnants of the bodies that lined the room. They were all around him, men, women, children, each one cruelly tortured and left to rot in the dark. Their faces twisted in agony, frozen in time. as if they had died only moments ago, and then, from the far corner, he saw her. Elise's body, her pale, lifeless form, was suspended in the air, bound by thick chains of blood that wrapped around her limbs. Her eyes were open, but they were hollow, devoid of life or consciousness. Her mouth, however, moved in a slow, guttural whisper, "Raphael, help me," but Raphael knew the truth now. She wasn't the woman he had loved. She wasn't even human anymore. Elise was nothing more than a puppet, a vessel for the curse that Lucien— And now, the curse had latched onto him, consuming him with its dark, twisted hunger. He turned away, his eyes filled with sorrow, as he heard the faint whisper of Lucien's voice from the shadows, echoing through the blood-soaked walls. This is only the beginning, and as the room grew darker still, Raphael knew the truth: there would be no escape. The curse of the blood had claimed him, and soon, it would claim everyone. The whispers of the dead grew louder, the bloodlust palpable. And as Raphael took one final, shuddering breath, he realized the nightmare was far from over.